As an entrepreneur, it is just natural for us to go for our peak performance, being able to perform at that highest level to get more sales and clients. And while we look to optimize our peak performance, one of the things that can happen as we try to achieve higher performance again and again is the increase in stress. So not only are we going to talk about how do we achieve our peak performance and stay there, but we're also going to talk about how do we cut down on the stress that usually goes hand in hand with the pursuit of continuous peak performance. So that's what we're talking about in this episode. We are joined by a guest who is the CEO of Arc Integrated, which is an organizational consulting and professional coaching practice. Our guest is a best-selling author, leadership coach, facilitator, and speaker, and his new book, Changes, is the busy professional's guide to reducing stress, accomplishing goals, and mastering adaptability. Our guest who joins us for this episode of Breakthrough Success is none other than Michael Diettrich-Chastain. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Marc. It's great to be here with you today.
Michael, I'm so happy to have you on Breakthrough Success. And I feel like peak performance is that thing so many people are just naturally gravitated towards, because I feel like people want to be their best selves, but on that journey, there could be a lot of stress. So I'm wondering if you could share with us, how can we go for peak performance without feeling stressed out about hitting that level each day?
Sure, absolutely. So, I think that stress management and peak performance are very much connected to each other, right? And so we can have high levels of performance, but unless we're managing our own internal state and some of the external practices that are so necessary, that peak performance will eventually fizzle out, right? And which is evident by all the cases of burnout that we see all over the country and all over the world. I would add that there's another element that I think is also connected to stress and peak performance, which is change management. So I think that the better we can get at managing, and not only managing, but being able to institute good practices as it relates to change, the less stress we become and the higher performing we become as well. So I think all three of these things are very much connected to each other.
Yeah, and the change is also something really important. And I'm happy you mentioned that, because, we could be on a groove, but then we change our routine, or we just get a big change thrown at us and now we have to adapt. So that's definitely important as well. So I think we'll focus first on the stress point, because that's like, if you do the other two things right, but you're stressed, that's like building a foundation on sand and you're by the beach. So I'm wondering if you could share with us, how do we better manage our stress? I don't want to act like there's a way to avoid stress for the rest of your life, but
Sure.
How do we better manage it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we're in a time right now where stress management is maybe of the utmost importance, given all the circumstances globally that are going on right now. And so having really good stress management practices is really important. And, that's really what it's about, Marc, in my opinion. All the folks that we work with, which are typically leaders or folks in C-suite in the context of organizations, stress comes up a lot. And that's often a question, like, what's the silver bullet for managing stress? And in my experience, it's less about the practice once we've become stressed, and more about instituting practices that allow that stress to be more managed on a regular basis. And so, the simple examples of things that we know, kind of over the years, the information that's thrown at us about good sleep, good exercise, good nutrition, all of that is super relevant as it relates to stress. But in addition to that, having really great daily practices, and those practices could look like a number of things. It could look like meditation. It could look like journaling. It could look like a gratitude practice. It could look like, a number of different things. And so my recommendation is always to folks, let's build some kind of daily practice so that when stress really spikes, you've got something to lean into.
And you mentioned things like sleep and meditation, and I'm going to go on a limb. First off, thank you for listening to this wherever you are, whether you are working out, you have some at-home workout set up right now, or thank you for listening to this episode. But I do want, from a listener standpoint, you hear sleep, you hear meditation, eat healthy. These are things that people hear a lot, but they're not necessarily people they listen to an episode and they're like, I'm making the change. Like, that's not what always happens. So how do we go from, okay, yes, sleep is important. Yes, meditation is important. Yes, I've heard this again and again, to actually making the changes in your life?
Yeah, I love that question. So again, thinking about kind of current state of affairs, that we're currently in this kind of social distancing environment. And in my opinion, this is a time in which maybe community matters in a way that it hasn't before. And so, and even more importantly, finding ways to connect with each other, which, and it's kind of an answer to your question, Mark. Like, yeah, we hear all these things, but, how do we really put them into action? One answer to that question is ensuring that we're surrounding ourselves with those people that also support the goals that we have. And one way to do that is get better at creating community. And that community, obviously, right now maybe looks like virtual communities, or looks like masterminds, or looks like, Zoom meetings, or whatever it is. But, having a community of accountability partners, of folks that will challenge us, of folks that will do exactly what you did, Mark, which is ask those questions of how do we take the thing that we hear all the time and actually put it into action. So surrounding ourselves with people that will push us to do that.
And for people looking for a group like that, I mean, we do have the Breakthrough Success Facebook group. So if you're listening to this episode and you're like, okay, Mark, this is like the 100th person you've brought on who said sleep, meditation, eat healthy. If you feel committed to making that happen, post something in the group, let us just know it's from this episode, and we'll support you in the group, because that's definitely something we want to do in that area. And this goes in nicely with the idea of peak performance, because it's not like people say, like, we're just going on this example. It's not like, people say, like, I want to get better sleep, I want a better health. Like, that stuff all comes back to peak performance and this desire for us to be better than who we were yesterday. So how do we get to that level of peak performance in our lives?
Yeah, it's great, Mark. So I, like you said, I know that a lot of people say the same thing about stress and about performance, and these regular practices that we hear. So let me, if it's okay, I'll tell you a little story, and then take a deeper dive into some ways of thinking about both stress and peak performance. Would that be all right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So as you mentioned in the intro, I work with a lot of leaders and teams around peak performance in the organizational sense, but haven't been there my whole career. And so I've spent my whole career in human development in some capacity. Some of that time has been in organizations and teams and effectiveness of human systems. And some of that time was as a psychotherapist, working with a wide variety of clients, from, the person that's barely getting their human needs met, to someone that's going through like an addiction or a separation or a move perhaps, to someone that, has a really successful business and wants to figure out how to create change there. And a few years ago, I started to ask myself this question: of the thousands of clients I've worked with over the years, what are the commonalities when it comes to creating a change? And in this case, the change being, how do we manage our stress more effectively, right? And so in my research, working with clients and reading the research, of course, that's out there, what I found is that there are 7 aspects of our lived experience that are basically the predictors of our stress and of our success. And so they're the influencers of any change that we want to make, whether that's we want to reduce our stress, we want to become a peak performer in business, we want to become, an athlete, whatever it is, right? And so if you'd like, I could list out those 7 elements of our lived experience. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So here they are. So I'll list them out in order, because it's an acronym so people can remember, and I can speak to that in a second as well. But the first one is cognition, which is the way that we think. So is our mind focused on opportunity? Is it focused on strength? Is it focused on creativity? Or is it focused on negativity or victimhood or whatever it is, right? So cognition is the first one. Heart is all about, that's number 2, emotional intelligence. So what are we doing to evaluate our emotional aspect of our lived experience, and how is that impacting our stress in this case, in this conversation, right? Number 3 is action. So our habits and routines, which I know your listeners have heard a ton about. So what are we doing daily, weekly, and monthly to create better habits and practices that will impact our stress? Number 4 is nourishment, which is all about our physical experience as humans. So how we sleep, how we eat, how we move, and all of those physical components that we know have drastically big impacts on our stress. And then we have guts, which is our level of courage to act. And so, Marc, I'm guessing that you can probably think of times or people that you know that have a ton of insight and have the answers to things, but maybe not the courage to act upon them. Can you think about
Oh
someone
yeah,
like that?
there's a lot of people like that, sadly.
Yeah, I'm certainly one of them. There's times in which, we have the answers, but we don't have the courage. And so that aspect of our life, guts, that courage, is so important, and also a predictor of any positive change we want to make. The next one is environment, which is the people, places, and things we surround ourselves with, which you and I touched on that a little while ago. So community is one way to think about environment, but another way to think about that is your neighborhood or your workplace, or where you spend your time online, or the things that you read, or the things that you listen to. All of that is what you're choosing to surround yourself with, which impacts your stress in this case. And finally, the last one is spirit, which is all about your belief systems, right? And that's not necessarily religious, although it could be, right? So your belief systems in what's possible within your life is in addition to your belief systems about, the bigger questions. Where were we? Where are we going? What happens when we die? All these big human questions that we have. And so all of these 7, Marc, are basically the major predictors of performance, as well as, in this case, stress. And for those that are listening, you probably figured it out, but the acronym for that is changes. And the reason that acronym was created is, acronyms are silly and kind of goofy, but they help people remember. And so there you go. That's the 7 influencers of stress.
We have more great content coming up in this episode, but first we have a message from our sponsors. So as you grow a business, one of the things you're just going to have to do is start hiring people. And this could be anything from hiring someone on Fiverr to having a part-time or even full-time virtual assistant. As businesses grow even more, they have to hire more people with all the responsibilities that come in. Now, one of the issues that a lot of people have is actually handing the work over to other people. And some people don't know how to build a great team around their business. A great team can help you grow. It helps you get in front of more customers, but you have to take that effort to build the team once you are ready to be at that level. So that's where Towards a Profit comes in. Towards a Profit helps business owners who want to radically improve their team. They also have a free assessment that will give you a better idea of where you are at. So if you guys want to learn more about that, head over to towardaprofit.com, which will be in the show notes. Anyways, let's jump right back into the episode. And like an acronym like that definitely does make it easier to remember. And like some of these things, like all these things are things we do subconsciously. But absolutely. Now it's more of a putting this in the spotlight. And that's how you get the different results. Like environment, we talked about that already. There's a digital component to your environment. There's a physical component to your environment. If you're not happy with the neighborhood you're in, just spend more time online with that community. I mean, there's different ways to address all of these different points to create that better version of yourself and chop away at some of the stress in your life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And, and for folks that are listening and maybe asking, because I get this question a lot, well, which one should I start with? Or which one is most important? The answer that I usually give to that is it's dependent upon the individual. And it's also dependent upon the season of life that we're in. Right. And so for any given person, it might be that at this moment, community is really important. Maybe environment is really important. Right. And it may be that in 6 months from now, heart, our emotional self maybe needs some healing or some work. And so, what I always invite people to do is, look at these 7 dimensions and consider, which one needs my attention most. And the other thing I would say, Marc, is they all have impact on each other, which is an important thing to remember, right? My actions, my emotions, my environment, they all influence one another. And I think that's an important thing to remember, is that all parts of our lived experience, they don't exist in silos, right? We can't separate them from each other. And so it's important to remember that we have this kind of cross-functioning influence every day, every week, every year, right?
And yeah, I mean, it's interesting how you go into that analysis where, you want to figure out which one makes most sense for you. I mean, with what's going on now at the time of this recording, I mean, like community, that is the big thing on everyone's mind right now. And One of the things also I want to explore is that you want to make the changes last. So at a time like this, just like digital communities are just going to become like the bigger presence type of setup. But then when everything goes back to normal, like, do you lose that, even like the good stuff you want to keep? So a classic example is, alcoholic goes to Alcoholics Anonymous, life changes there. I'm not saying this is true for everyone, but like in this example, like the person's life gets changed, they get sober, but then they leave the group or something like that, and then they go back to their old ways. So how can we, when we feel good about the where we are, how do we stay in that spot rather than, and I know I mentioned the community environment example, but I feel like you could apply this to all of the 7 things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say 2 things about that. The first one is, I think that, as human beings, we have the expectation that things will last. And the reality is that's just not true. Nothing is permanent, right? And so I think that's the first kind of mental hurdle for all of us to get over, is that things are not permanent. Health and relationships and work and money, all of this is subject to change, right? And that's not a bad thing. That's not to institute fear or institute insecurity in any way. It's just to accept the fact that, things are fluid, things move, right? And like we're saying in this conversation, Mark, like at the point of this recording, we're in a bit of a kind of a global crisis, and in a few months it'll be different, right? We'll be dealing with other challenges. And so, in answer to your question, I think that's the first thing, is to accept that change is always happening, right? And then the second piece, as long as we can accept that that's the truth, is to know that each of these 7 elements may need attention at one point or another, right? And the other thing I would say is that it can be easy for us to ignore, 1 or 2 of them, right? So I'll give you an example. I work with a lot of like high achievers. And so for them, it might be that, their habits and routines are on point. They get up at 4:30 and they're doing their daily practice, and they hit the gym, and they're at work by 6:30 every day or 7, and they're working hard, and they're in peak physical shape, and they are making a ton of money, and they're good leaders. And it might be that their emotional self is really hurt or wounded or ignored, right? And so the consequence of that is that their relationships with maybe loved ones might really need their attention. And so I think that the risk can be that we drive all of our attention to 2 or 3 or 4 of the 7 dimensions and lose track of the others. And again, what that will do over time is really undermine our performance sustainably, which I think was the nature of your question. How do we create sustainable performance? To me, the way to do that is to not ignore even a couple of the 7 influencers.
And that's a great point, because I feel like when people, because peak performance, a big part of that is expansion. You want to, do more than what you've already done. Like if you've written a book, it's like, great, let me write more books. Let me do more courses. Let me do more summits. So you're naturally thinking that way. It becomes an issue when you say, okay, let me do this. And then you forget about this thing, you forget about something else. And that's when it becomes an issue. So, I mean, even something as simple, I would definitely recommend, if you're still listening to this because you're hearing this part, I would recommend that you take out a sheet of paper, you write down all of the action items. We'll go through them really quick. Cognition, heart, actions, nourishment, guts, environment, and spirit. I would go through all 7 of those again and just like write down like 1 to 3 ways for each one, like how you are moving yourself in the right direction. I think if you do that each day, that's going to really set you up for that long lasting change, instead of the example I gave where it's like you go to AA if you were an alcoholic, and then your life has changed forever, and then you leave that program and then you go back to your old ways. So I think it's just a matter of putting it at the forefront of what you do.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. And at the end of this, if you'd like, I'm happy to give away some gifts to your listeners, and I can explain where they can do that if they're interested in really taking some of this content and applying it, like you said. And I love that example that you gave. It's an easy way to immediately evaluate these 7 dimensions. And there are also a bunch of other activities that you can take to operationalize some of these ideas that we're talking about.
And would you mind we just go into that, just share with us like the resources that you have in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so the Changes acronym comes from the name of the book, which is Changes. And what we're doing for folks is we're giving away a number of copies of that book. And what I mean by that is the digital version is available, as well as the audio version, and people can download those for free. The website is www.thechangesbook.com. And in addition to that audio that they'll also get a workbook, which is really in addition to what you're saying, Marc. It's activities within each of the 7 dimensions so that people can ensure that they're optimizing each for success, to reduce stress, and to maintain positive, sustainable change. And so they can download that entire bundle for free at thechangesbook.com.
Well, we will have that link down in the show notes. We'll also have the link to the Breakthrough Success Facebook group. I know I mentioned that already for people who want that community that's going to support them on their goals. But Michael, thank you so much for joining us on Breakthrough Success. It was such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marc. It was great.